Dear students, welcome to week 6. This week we continue to explore cultural dimensions and in particular those created by Geert Hofstede. As you remember from the previous class, we examined Edward Hall, context high and versus low context communication cultures, and we learned that this is probably one of the most significant factors that affect cultural differences, that is the way we communicate. We know that it refers to how people interact with each other and communicate with members of their own cultures, and how they deal with members of different cultures when they communicate. And we remember low context is both Western, Anglo-American, Northern European, partly also Southern European way of communication, direct, explicit, verbal. However, part of Southern European cultures, as well as Southern American cultures or Middle Eastern cultures, share also traits with the high context communication group, which is more the Asian, where information lies in the context, where people don't talk so directly, and where reasoning is not logic in a linear way, but logic in a holistic way. Today we're going to explore other dimensions, as I said, that can be very useful for you to classify and understand cultural differences and make use of them when you negotiate or mediate. Today I want to, as we have talked a lot about negotiation in the previous lessons, today let's focus a little bit more on mediation and see, for example, how a mediator can deal with some of these dimensions when they come up in a mediation. But I would say same concept may apply to a negotiator. Power distance. Power distance is the dimension that refers to how we refer ourselves to hierarchy, or if you want to say more objectively, how the less powerful members in a culture see the members in higher members in the hierarchy in their culture. And we distinguish two groups. One is going to be the high power distance culture group, where status is the most important thing. So you have a pyramid, and on top sits someone with a higher status. In many cases you will see it's about age, seniority. Asian cultures belong traditionally to high power distant cultures. Same for some Middle Easterns. Hierarchy is everything, because it is how values are built. They're built in a hierarchical manner. If you think about Asian society, as all of them, especially Northeast Asia, Korea, Japan, and China, heavily affected by a similar historical background, and philosophically speaking, we're talking about Confucianism as a philosophy that it is very common to all these cultures. Confucianism is the philosophy from Confucius. He was a philosopher and a government official in China and in the Middle Ages of China, and he created the basic principles of the hierarchical system of those cultures. And respect the elders, respect your parents, respect the government, respect those who are in higher position. Only by doing this you maintain harmony in society. And everything is built on a delicate ladder system that cannot be upset without jeopardizing the harmony of those society. So this is what is a power distance. We see the people in really a pyramidal way, right? And depending where you are on the pyramid, you can enjoy a certain authority over others, but you might have to respect the authorities of others above you. On the other hand, you have a Western, very Anglo-American, very Northern European, low power distance culture, where we are equal. Yeah, we're equal, and there's less dependence on superiors, and there's more interdependence between the people. When we form a team in the office, there will be a team leader for sure, but we all have equal rights to speak, equal rights to criticize, and doing it openly. You remember I spoke already in a previous class of brainstorming, very typical of low power distant culture, because brainstorming within a group, take your classic office meeting where you can, brainstorming requires you to criticize even your boss position, and that is almost unthinkable in high power distant culture. I lead still nowadays, after 15 years, a team of Chinese attorneys and paralegals and investigators, and they're all sitting in China, most of them. There's a couple in the LA office with me. I would never expect them to criticize me. Even if my most senior associates have been with me for 15, 17 years, they wouldn't dare saying that they disagree with me. They may put forward their opinion, which could be completely the opposite of mine, but they phrase me, and they phrase it in a way that is very respectful of my position as their supervisor and their boss. Okay, so this is what the difference is. And brainstorming, believe me, I have taught them low power distance. I have told them that I expect them to criticize me. I expect them to express openly and freely their opinions, and I encourage brainstorming. But still, I think I have to do a lot of, and I anticipate here a word, Socratic questioning, to have them come out with their true feelings and true opinions. Because if I didn't, they wouldn't. Okay, so this is a clear example of this dimension brought back to my personal experience, for example. Moving on to the next slide. So, as I said before, high power distant cultures, typically Asian, they respect seniority. And if you are in a negotiation or even in a mediation and you have a group of people on one side from Asia, the most senior one will be likely the one at the center, the most important person. They expect to be also recognized as such. In the reading of this week, I think I put you something as a personal story, and I learned the lesson of power distance because I didn't recognize the power of a certain individual in a group, a certain Chinese, one of the members of the group composing my client, which was composed by Chinese and French managers. I couldn't recognize the position of power of this Chinese person, and that created a lot of troubles to me in the relation with my client. So because I didn't recognize immediately his position, and I involuntarily offended him, and that took time to rebuild the relation. It took time. So it's energy that you don't want to waste, and therefore be careful about this point. Seniority is very important in Asian culture, high power distant cultures, and addressing the people correctly. It's important. That's why there's always this ritual. I don't know if you've ever been in meetings with the Asian counterparts, but they will give you the first thing they do, they'll give you their business cards with both hands on the card and bowing forward in a gesture of respectful greeting. They'll give you the card, and you're supposed to give yours. And what they do, they'll sit at the table, and they will put your card in front of them. And they will make sure that to address you with the titles that are printed on that card. Okay, so that explains why they're so keen on those business card exchange, because it's a way to guarantee that I will be able to respect your position, understand your position, and respect it and address you properly during the meeting. Obviously, if you don't do this, if you misstep, you create troubles. There are sensibilities hurt, And as I just told you, an example from my personal experience, and I think is in the case study this week on that patent infringement case, there was a clear example where I personally, you see, even your teacher, even your instructor makes mistake, even after so many years of experience. The situation there, you will see there was an asymmetry of information. There was a wrong information provided by the client that misled us and therefore made us make that mistake. But I don't want to use that as an excuse. The fact remains that status and high power was not recognized, and that created a problem. So because the person was offended, and then you have to work hard to rebuild the relation. Excuse me. On the other hand, in low power distance, treat everyone equally, and we tend to be rather informal. I want to say again, I speak several languages. Many of you probably speak different languages. You know very well that English is the most informal of all of them, right? We use the you to refer to anybody, even in a formal way, whereby most of the languages have different forms to address people in a formal, respectful way. So, and we make an effort to use those forms rather than the colloquial one when we meet people in high power distance cultures. But within us, I know that even younger people, when they write, even students, they tend to immediately say, can we, be on a familiar terms? Can I call you Paolo? Without, I wouldn't do that to a German, for example. Germans are very formal in this sense. They Chinese for sure, no. Japanese, no. Maybe Indonesians and Thai, they're very, very careful about titles, right? So we can't be informal with them, but we can be informal within low power distance cultures. Obviously, power distance affects a lot of things, affect decision making, because in high power distance cultures, decision making can be more complex because there may be more levels to go through to get a decision, whereby a Western negotiator may have power of decision when it goes to the meeting straight away. This causes often contrast and conflicts because obviously there could be embarrassing situation where a junior on the American side goes to a meeting with power of decision, and the other side as a senior, even in terms of age, deciding, but the decision still has to be, confirmed within the group, because high power distance mediators or parties or negotiators are also, we will see, collectivist, so that affects their decision making. The mediator is affected too, because the mediator will have to understand what's going on, right? And will have to understand how to handle this delicate ceremonials and rituals. And also it may be affected as in his own authority, because a Western mediator, let's say mediating between a low power distance and a high power distance parties, it may be considered inferior by the high power distance group to their own boss. That would put the mediator in a difficult situation because he would have to deal with someone who feels superior to him. And this someone on the high power distance group might look down on him as lacking authority. So that's all things that you have as a mediator and also as a negotiator, keep in mind. So as a mediator in particular, so today we can give some tips more to the mediators than negotiators. We can say we encourage a mediator to match ranks. So I would say if you come to the first meeting with a low level manager on the American side, and then you have on the other side of the dispute, you have a high level manager for the Chinese or Japanese or Middle Eastern counterpart, well, at the next meeting, you need to bring in your CEO. Because if you don't do that, they might just abandon the mediation because they feel offended, right? The mediator also should not be offended if, and I just said before, it might not be treated with the same respect that he would receive normally from the low context side of the mediation, because they say, okay, we're all equal, we respect you because we respect everybody as a human being, right? So these are all dynamics you have to think about when you mediate in cross-cultural contexts. Individualism and collectivism. Here We look at how much a culture reinforces individual achievement and interpersonal relationships. Okay, individualists. Individualism is our culture, is the Western culture, right? To make it very simple, I would say the American probably is one of the greatest examples of individualism, right? We believe in our rights, we believe in our own well-being, we believe in our own success, we care about all of these things. When I go to negotiation, I want to shine, I want to win, I want to get credit, I want to get money. So we are motivated by all these things. We are motivated by freedom, and we also value our individual rights. We are the center of the universe. We are a little bit egocentric. Okay, individualists think about themselves first. On the other hand, you have cultures that are collectivistic in form. So they sacrifice all those things: my personal time, personal freedom, even rights, and surely your personal egoistic motivations like money or fame or acknowledgement. They sacrifice it for the interest of the group. You remember from the video in the homework of last week, the Japanese say, Japanese workers don't stay in the factory extra time because they want the extra pay. They stay because they love their company, because they're proud to work for their company. They want to do their best for the company, not for themselves, not for their extra money, not for a promotion, but for the well-being of the company. Because the well-being of the company, it means the well-being of all the members of the group in the company, right? So face saving in and outside group are very critical components. So you can see already high power distance, collectivism, high context. It's kind of a line that connects all these cultures, right? If you're high context, you might be likely collectivistic, you might be likely a high power distance person. On the other hand, if you are low context, you're likely going to be individualistic and a low power distance. So we see a line that divides a little bit east and west, in cultural terms. But now you understand why these dimensions are so important, because they give you a new lens, because your lens right now was just a window of your own culture. After you have self-awareness, as we said before, and you will be able, using those dimensions, to explore common values and common interests, because they will be an additional window for you to see the world in a different way than compared to your simple cultural window. This dimension expand your ability to see, kind of like a magnifier, cultural magnifier. In mediation, obviously, if you look at all these dimensions, including, of course, now here in particular individualism and collectivism, you have to deal with those challenges, right? High-low context communication, individuals, so we have different values, different principles, we have different goals. So either the deal or the relationship, right? Because obviously collectivist people will privilege relation over immediate satisfaction, while the individualistic people will tend to privilege the here and now, right? So as I said before, using the early mediation for a mediator to learn all these differences. If you take all this, okay, this party A is high context, collectivistic, and high power. Good. Now I know what it means. I know how I can try to reduce the impact and fill the gap with the other party B, which is the complete opposite, is on all the other spectrum on the thing. So using a pre-mediation in particular to learn about those cultures and use your new tools to define them, classify them, define them will be very helpful for you. In decision making, individualistic, they tend to have individual decision maker. I already think I said this before. In the collectives, it's going to be a group decision. And obviously in the mediation, you should identify and clarify this decision-making process as soon as possible so that you're not going to waste time, because you might be going rounds and talking to someone believing that you can get a decision from this person, but in the end you don't, because you haven't understood that he is not the person who's going to make the decision. So that's why you want to understand all these dimensions in order to avoid those problems. Here's some tips again for the mediators. How you deal with the individualists? Well, praise them, tell them how good they are, right? And then link their individual needs with those of the group or the organization. So you can finally bridge them, their egocentric position with that of the group. Embrace brainstorming. It might be hard for a high context person to embrace brainstorming because it affects the status issue, but you can do that. And here's the tips for dealing with collectivists. Praise all agreements, small and large, right? Try to make stakeholders participate and underline and stress their importance of the impact they're having on the negotiation, because it gives the collective group a role and an importance in the negotiation, right? And allow others to be involved in decision making. Don't push for decision. Respect that they may have a longer process. Another dimension, we move on. Assertiveness versus cooperativeness, also called masculinity versus femininity, but we don't want to have, in modern times, these terms might be misinterpreted, and therefore what Hofstede called masculinity versus femininity nowadays is assertiveness versus cooperativeness. This is cultures that tend to be more aggressive, more masculine in this sense, power-centered in doing negotiation, versus those that are more, guess what, cooperative, right? Now, a certain negotiator will attempt to dominate through power tactics, right? And will be less willing to make concessions. There are cultures that are more assertive than others because, and you remember when we do the prototypes, we talk about honor cultures like South Americans, Middle Eastern, they belong clearly to this group of negotiators. They tend to be more assertive and using more power tactics because it's a cultural thing, right? We're talking about culture. So on the other hand, the cooperative negotiators are more likely to look for a win-win solution. That would be the problem-solving type of negotiator. You remember week 4 when we talk about the type of negotiators. In terms of type of powers that you could find being used against you, or you could wield against others to be assertive, there's coercive power, which is the strongest power, the ability to punish. So you're in such a position where the dynamic of power is so asymmetrical and is all on your side. You, in that case, have the ability to force an agreement or win a mediation because it's simply you hold the key, right? So this is the more classic way of power. Then you have those that wield the power of connection, who I know, whom I'm related with. This is very common in many cultures. Yeah, even in Europe, Eastern Europeans, tend to have that kind of type of use of that type of power because hierarchy is very important, and therefore I can, rely on that. Influence, right? Because I'm very skilled in one area, I can bargain for myself. Information, when there's this information asymmetry and I know I have more information you don't have, I can exert that power on you, right? Titles, like legitimate influence by ascription or titles, personal power, like based on popularity, and reward means I have resources or things you desire that I will show in front of, swing in front of you to make you concede and come on my side. So aggressive cultures will tend to use all these tricks. Another dimension is that of uncertainty avoidance. So this is the level of tolerance for the ambiguity within a culture, and it measures the extent to which people feel threatened by unknown situations. You will see that unlike the other dimensions, where we saw a red line connecting high context to high power, to collectivism, and to cooperative rather than assertive, whereby you have low context, low power distance, individualistic, and more aggressive type of negotiators or litigants. Uncertainty avoidance, it's across. You will see, like, for example, a high uncertainty avoidance culture is characterized as being rule-based society that institutes rules, laws, and regulations to create universal parameters. So here we would say more universalistic cultures tend to be more uncertainty avoidance, right? They want predictability. And that doesn't mean that the high context, which are particularistic and not universalistic, they also would like probably predictability, right? So they're less flexible. So you will find in groups with high uncertainty avoidance, both the American, which is low context, individualistic, low power, universalistic, and you'll find the Chinese, which are the exact opposite. So this is a kind of a category that kind of mix the cards a little bit, and you have to look at a little bit of a group of parameters, and the low uncertainty avoidance culture show more tolerance for variety of opinions, are less rule oriented, and they're good inventing options, and accept change and take greater risks. So you will think more low context, individualistic, but at the same time you will see other cultures that are the opposite, that are also low on uncertainty avoidance. Last one of the dimension, before last one, is the long-term orientation versus short-term orientation. Long-term orientation cultures tend to respect thriftiness, status, and order. So you can tell already more or less they fall into the group of the high context. And the short-term orientation, they want a deal done now. So obviously it seems to fall more on the individualistic, low context group of cultures. And then you have monochronic versus polychronic. This is how you perceive time. I think I have said this since the beginning of our classes. Westerners tend to be monochronic, means that we look at things in a linear order and in a logic, rational sequence. And we value punctuality and planning. On the other hand, you have polychronic behavior, and I said to you many times when I was talking the example of the Japanese council on the phone, and I was thinking that I was moving from point 1 to point 2 and point 3, but then a few days later we'll be back at point 1 again, because they don't see the same way, and they have a more holistic way to reason, and therefore a polychronic way of calculating time. So they can deal with many things at the same time in a circular manner. So keep that on time, because you will avoid a lot of frustration. So how to then deal with all those things, right? During the meetings, especially the mediators can assess whether substantive issues are less important than the implicit factors. It is very important. If you don't understand that by not respecting hierarchy, for example, it can lead to a failure of the mediation, you'll have to put that issue in front, even a substantive one. And you'll have to do it as soon as possible so that we are clear on power distance, or we are clear on communication styles. Okay? So then after you have fixed all these things, then you can strategize how to help the parties resolve these implicit issues, right? First, you recognize them as soon as possible. Then you tackle them, and then you help the parties. One way is to, and you will see, is to ask questions, to have the parties talk to each other about those issues, explain to each other their culture, so that we can find common grounds so now that you know what to do, you know when to do it. Pre-mediation is very important, and also during the caucus, bringing the parties together, help them fix those issues. And how can all the parties do that? Is by using the Socratic method. Socrates was this Greek philosopher, that he was very famous for saying that I know nothing, and the only thing I know is that I know nothing. Okay, so a very relativistic thinker. His disciple Plato wrote many of the dialogues of Socrates, and you can see the model of questioner. So if you read the Republic, which is one of the easiest books of Plato to read, it's the Socratic method. He asks question, kind of pulling out, through questioning, pulling out the things from the other side, so that the other side think, oh, this is coming from me. In reality, it seems inducing them to do that through questioning. And using this kind of questioning, Socratic method, it's very important. There's a nice example from a book of an author that I like a lot. It's David Lodge, right? Stories in the 80s, a lot about academics. Doing there's one about one English and American academics doing an exchange. One lives in England, one lives in California. It's very funny book. And in one of his books, in this case, Nice Work of 1988, he writes about this story. And you can read it yourself, or I can read it to you. She could see that he was trying to teach the other man, to coax and persuade them to look at the factory's operation in a new way. You would have been surprised to be told, but he used the Socratic method. He prompted the other directors and the middle managers and even the foreman to identify the problems themselves and to reach by their own reasoning the solutions he had himself already determined upon. So this is a very nice description and simplification of what a Socratic method is. And I think you as a mediator can use that to your own profit. And here comes the last slide of this long class. And when the parties are reaching impasse and they do not seem aware or interested in the importance of the cultural differences, employing the Socratic method of teaching can be very helpful. In this way, the mediator can incorporate reality testing. This is a very good point. And other factors in the discussion. Use reframing as well, I would say. In this way, allows the party to preserve their faith and to move on and avoid the trap of many of the implicit biases that we have seen. As a mediator, keep those in mind and use the Socratic method to reduce the impact of those. Okay, I hope this was useful, and I thank you for your attention.